So, to start us today, whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mākina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai, kia hi aki ana te atakura, he teo, he huka, he hauhu, tihei, Māori ora. So welcome everybody. This is the second accessibility workshop that Tom Smith from Blind Low Vision is running for LIANZA, and we're really pleased to be able to be offering this to you. So today he's going to be talking about creating accessible resources. Last month he talked about accessible technology in the library, and if you didn't attend that, I'll put the link to the recording into the chat at some stage this morning if you want to go back and check that. And then after today there are a couple more workshops, one on accessible features and then making accessible copies. So those over the next couple of months. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much, Tom, and I'll hand it over to you now.
All right, good morning everyone. Thanks for coming along. And yeah, so in this session, what I'll be, this is sort of as Anna was saying, this is part 2. So in the first session, what we focused on was a lot of the accessible technology that's currently available. And in this one, what we're looking at is what I was saying is accessible resources, but it's also a lot of applies to a lot of the content that you have in the library. So some of this content we're talking about is like ePUB accessibility. So it's relevant to that, as well as creating your own resources. So it kind of merges over the two. Very early on when I was doing a lot of presentations, someone came up to me and said afterwards, they said, Tom, I really liked your presentation because it was really practical and I can go away and do some of the things straight away, and that really struck with me. So I hope you get that too, that there'll be something within this presentation that you'll be able to take away so that you can do it, or that you can use. So I split it up into 2 parts. The first part is actually looking at standards and international standards around. I'm focusing on on book material, on things that are relevant to books and print material, and then there's only a little bit about that. And then the second part is when I get into the good stuff, and that's when it's all the tips about accessibility and how you can make your content accessible. And the reason why I put this in this order is because I really see, in the first workshop that we did, or the first presentation that I did, what we focused on was the technology that's available. And so we've got things like VoiceOver on our iPads and iPhones, and we've got all this amazing technology, but that doesn't work if the content isn't accessible. So I kind of, in my mind, see it as like a bridge that on 2 parts that have to come together. And as you'll find, sort of like in our demonstration that we do in the next one, when I actually take like Libby, I think is the one that we'll be looking at, and looking at how Libby works with the accessibility features, you'll see that sort of like the screen reader might work, but it might not read some of the images because the alternate text hasn't read. So that's why I've kind of structured it in this kind of like format. Anyway, please ask any questions. Anna and I were talking about this before, about saying that people are a bit shy about asking questions, but I love it. It's the way we, there's no such thing as a stupid question. And so please raise your hand and in the chat and ask a question. If I don't know, I'll probably be able to help you find out. So please ask any questions. Okay, so like I said, I was going to start off by looking at accessibility standards. Okay, so we're talking about ePUB files as the main one. And if you don't know really what an ePUB file is, ePUB is primarily a lot of the print content that's available in things like BorrowBox, Libby, and Wheelers. It is what's referred to in like an ePUB format. And it's an international standard. It was developed by the International Publishers Federation, but it now sits in the World Wide Web Consortium as a standard. Essentially, if you look under the hood of an ePUB, it's like this is a little bit of an oversimplification, but it's like a little miniature web page in one file to be able to get through the book. And so that's why now, in 2022, a lot of the web standards that we're actually seeing are actually now applying to ePUB standards as well. So they're now kind of merging across. So that's what I'm talking about there. There was a tool for making standards of ePUBs. There was ACE by Daisy. It sounds kind of fancy, but ACE is the accessibility checker for ePUB. So it's a very sort of an interesting acronym. And if you're wondering what Daisy is, Daisy has been an accessible format that's existed for a really long time. I like to think of it as kind of like a navigable audio. It's sort of like, so it's very much a speech-driven audiobook format that goes through. And DAISY stands for Digital Accessible Information System. So the SY is the system. So if you're creating ePUB, if anybody's out there interested in creating your own ePUB content, if you've got your novel all set up, there's a variety of software that's actually available. And the reason why I included these is that some of them have accessibility checkers sort of built in, or plugins that you can use to check them for accessibility. Some of them not so much, but I'll just quickly run through the different applications you can use to create an ePUB file. The first one is Sigil, and the reason why I bring that one up is that it's because it's a free open source program or piece of software that you can use to create ePUB. It existed a long time ago, and then it died, and then now it's sort of being reborn and is taken off again. And that's I mean, I recently created all the accessible ePUBs for the previous election, so a lot of the material in accessible ePUB, and I mostly use Sigil to be able to create that. The reason why I like Sigil is that because I can get into the code, much like a website, if you can imagine sort of like going into the code, does make it a little bit easier to kind of create an more accessible content if you do understand the code a little bit more. So Sigil, I really like, and the fact that it was free and open source is really helpful too. Of course, there's an industry standard is Adobe InDesign, and I really like InDesign. I'm a kind of a designer at heart, as sort of we'll get into, but it's still, I feel its roots are still very in print, and I find making accessible content with ePUB, although technically possible, and there's some great resources to do it, I found quite tricky and and so there were odd glitches that would do things that are wrong. One way to actually probably make an accessible ePUB quite easily is actually, would you believe, Microsoft Word. The DAISY consortium that I was just talking about before, they've created a plugin that you can put into Word. So you go File, Save as DAISY. What's brilliant about it is that it does an accessibility check at the same time. So it works really well. Pages on a Mac and iOS also have Save as ePUB now, but they don't really have a checker built into it. And also Google Docs, because I know sort of also has Save as ePUB now. So it's really great. I mean, we're really big fans of the ePUB format, and we would like to be able to push it out a little bit more. I think that one of the stumbling blocks, again, if I speak sort of openly, is proprietary formats like Kindle have sort of AWS, and sort of Apple a little bit have their iBooks format, and they're proprietary formats that sort of, I think, sometimes stop the growth of open source formats. So it all comes down to money again, I guess. Okay, and now the big one is accessible PDF. Yes, it does exist. I think people get a little bit shocked that there is actually an ISO standard for a PDF. PDF has an accessible standard that's called UA, which stands for Universal Accessibility. A was already taken for PDF archive, so be careful that the PDF A is different from PDF UA. I've got to admit, I haven't really seen it in the wild very much. It's only something sort of us sort of accessibility geeks sort of talk about that's actually out there. So I don't actually see it a lot. PDF is largely seen as being quite as an inaccessible format, and that's largely to do with photocopiers, because if you take a photocopier, you scan a document, it just becomes a bunch of images that can't be read by a screen reader. And so that's why a lot of people view a PDF as being an inaccessible format. It's to do with the tools that create the PDF. So that's what we're talking about, scanned documents become quite problematic within sort of like PDF. Adobe Acrobat has a really good checker in it. And that will actually have and what I liked about it is that it would check your PDF for accessibility and sort of hold your hand through the process, so that you didn't have to be like an accessibility expert to go through. There's like a wizard that you would actually go through that whole process. But again, shockingly, my view is that to create a accessible PDF, the best software is probably to use Microsoft Word. So if you use some of the advice that I talk later on and apply that and then save it as a PDF, you'll have quite a nice accessible PDF too. Right. So one of the things that I still kind of a little bit surprised about is that there's no actual standards for print, sort of in terms of accessibility. So an actual physical print book, there isn't sort of like an ISO standard of how accessible it actually should. But there are some sort of guidelines that do actually kind of can help out. And I just wanted to highlight a few of them here. I mean, one I've already talked about is the web content accessibility guidelines. So for example, they have guidelines on color contrast that I do sort of transpose into print, because they use a mathematical model on how to measure color contrast so it can pass or fail. It becomes a bit like getting a warrant of fitness for your print book, because you can say pass or fail. However, it does, I mean, the reason why I picked color contrast as an example is that I've found it very useful, because when I've been talking to graphic designers and about accessibility, about the documents and books, I can say this, well, this fails this guideline. I mean, okay, great, and they'll change it. But the colors that we have on a web page or a website aren't the same as the kind of colors we can have on a book. You can also read a book in the dark and not in the light. So there's some things that don't really transfer across very nicely. So at the end of the day, there isn't a really strong guideline on sort of on a print book, or it's a big standard on a print book. But just to note, there's also the New Zealand government web standards, which are kind of the web content accessibility guidelines, but they're given a New Zealand sort of flavour to them. And so I've worked with them a little bit on those standards in the past, and so that's mostly for central government, local. I've worked with local government as well, and a lot of councils, and being able to do that in terms of applying it to the web content. The other two that I wanted to point out, especially the Universal Design for Learning, which is definitely some great accessibility guidelines within the education space that we have in New Zealand. And the other one that's been really popular is the UK Home Office accessibility posters as well. They've been really popular. Okay, now the reason why you may be scratching your head, why do I have a smashed pavlova sitting on the screen? The reason for this is that in finishing off talking about the standards and documents, is that often I would get a document, especially like a PDF or an ePUB, and it would be sent to me and they'd say, oh, can you fix it and make it accessible? And in my mind, it was a bit like receiving a cake like this and telling me to kind of fix it. And so often I'd want to start all over again to be able to create the document. And hence why another motivation of why I want to get into the advice about trying to create better documents and better resources out there, because it will just mean so much better for people that are using assistive technology. And surprisingly, you'll probably find you start using the tools as they were supposed to be used as well. So I've found being more accessible has made me more efficient at making resources. And it's much clearer and easier to understand. So I'm not wanting to throw my laptop out the window trying to format a document. But yeah, I think that's the thing with accessibility, is that yeah, I mean, the metaphor that we kind of use is that if you were creating a building, you wouldn't build the building and then put the elevator in. You would do it at the same time. And the accessibility is really kind of the same and within resources is pretty much the same thing. It's not something that you add on at the end or want to check for it. One of the things that we like to think of as accessibility is a bit like doing a spell check within your document. And Word, because I'm guessing, I still use Word a lot, has a built-in accessibility checker, and I'll be taking a look at that. Okay, so we're getting to the good stuff now, which is the accessibility advice. Now, when I first started doing this sort of training with the accessibility, I tried to come up with a mnemonic or a way of remembering how all the bits of random information I had about accessibility with resources, all the ones that I needed to cover. And I came up with one, and it was filth, which I wasn't happy about because it wasn't the greatest word that I wanted associated with, but it took off and it went sort of, it's probably the closest I'll ever get to going viral. I think my favorite one was, I think it got tweeted out in Portuguese at one point. And this was a mnemonic that I had in my head to be able to remind people of the top things to deal with, sort of like accessibility, to make sure that your content is accessible. So they are fonts, images, layout, tables, and headings to go through. So we're just going to go through those things, and yeah, we'll go on from there. Okay, so fonts, or so any designers that are out there, typefaces. Okay, so in short, fonts, what they do is they sort of come into sort of two different types of categories. So we've got serif and we've got sans serif. So serif has all the little lines all over it, has all the little extra details in it, and sans serif, my apologies for the, I think I was using it with the screen share, it's cut off, as sans serif is without the little lines all over it. So the idea was that the serif fonts, and this was the thinking in the past, was that the serif fonts, which things like Times New Roman, Garamond, were more aimed for print resources rather than electronic resources, to help sort of break up the page a little bit and make it a little bit easier to read. And the sans serif fonts were more merged from a digital point of view and more used for screens. However, the screen resolutions are now getting so good now that a lot of this advice doesn't really sort of like apply so much. So I think a lot of people get a bit disappointed with my advice about fonts and typefaces, because really the advice with using with fonts and typefaces is just to not use anything too sort of ornate or too kind of curly. And I think people get sort of quite disappointed because people like talking a lot about fonts and typefaces and choosing fonts and typefaces. And I spend a lot of time in design agencies discussing fonts, and more conversations with sighted people than I have with anybody who sort of said, oh, I can't really read that because of an accessibility issue. And in fact, probably the most common area I see of sort of font abuse is restaurant menus, because you are reading them usually in the dark, and it's usually quite cursive, and you're trying to kind of being able to read it in the distance. But most of the time, fonts are actually okay. And so just moving on from that. So I've got here sort of like some different types of fonts. And so I've got so good sort of serif fonts, sans serif fonts. So we've got and then really a bad font is one that's just very, very ornate, which I think, you know, most of the time people avoid anyway. I still get surprised every now and then. I have seen a formal report written in Jokerman, which I was quite surprised. I think it was a financial report for some reason. But most of the time, yeah, the fonts are just fine. And as I'm saying, and the designer in me really gets it, because I've seen the Helvetica documentary. I'm a bit of a typophile. I can tell the difference between Helvetica and Arial. I know all these things. But from an accessibility point of view, most of the time, most fonts are okay. Okay, just a few sort of like tips on things. So when you're wanting to emphasize text, using bold is probably the best way to emphasize text without reducing readability. This is another one where all the other things like underline and italics, etc., aren't necessarily wrong, but bold seems to be kind of the least, has the least sort of wrong with it, if that makes any sense. And to tell a little story, I remember we were working on some documentation for some new software that we were using internally here at Blind Low Vision NZ. And my colleague had written some documentation for this things, and she had some italics in it. And then I sort of turned around and I sort of said to her, oh, we try and avoid using italics because people that use magnification, it can kind of look a little blurry. And I kind of felt a little silly because she was using the Zoom text with the magnification and she created the document with italics. So a lot of this sort of what I think is there's sort of a spectrum of accessibility issues that we've got here. But what I've kind of noticed is that bold text, and it's not just me, it's sort of from the advice that we see sort of around the world, is the one that is we find is the best way to emphasize text without sort of reducing any readability. That's not to say that using other methods is very bad. Okay, so another one that I just threw in here as well, and the reason why I threw this, why I put this in, is obviously another aspect of accessibility is to do with not just the being able to see it, but being readable as well. And the reason why I put in the Flesh Reading Ease score is there is actually a built-in checker in Microsoft Word that can test your readability scores. You do have to go into the proofing settings of Word and then check it so that it's actually on. But then what it does is it uses sort of some algorithms on your document, and then it will give you a score, and then that score is sort of like provides you with a reading ease. If you Google Flesh Reading Ease, then you can sort of, it will tell you more about it. I do remember like Moby Dick, I think, got one of the worst scores for it. It sort of was up there with like insurance policies. And then what I've found has been a useful tool when I've received some documents that or a report that was very wordy. I kind of said, hey, it scored really bad, it scored really high on this score, rather than me just saying, oh, I don't think it's really written very well. So it's a nice resource to be able to kind of tell people that, this isn't very sort of a friendly document, you've made it a bit too wordy. So that kind of speaks to sort of the plain English aspect to sort of accessibility, and a tool that that you probably already have that can help. Okay, so that was F for fonts. So moving on to images, which I think is a big one, especially when it comes with books, because I'm finding more often that images are a tricky area with screen readers and using books. And so I just wanted to talk about mostly sort of the alternative text. So alternative text provides a textual alternative to non-text content. So usually it's a description of what's going on within the page. And there are a number of factors to get into it. So it becomes a bit of an art in creating good alternative text, as opposed to not just sort of like a science to it. So one area, so if I just sort of like give a few examples, I think is probably the best way to go ahead. So what I've got here is an image of two elephants. There's a baby elephant nuzzling into an adult elephant. When I used to do these like morning sessions on accessibilities, I get people to try and to write a description for it. And it's interesting that some people will get quite detailed into what the background is, and sort of like, there's green foliage in the background, and so people can get quite carried away with providing too much information that's in there. And I think probably the big word to think of when you're providing alternative text is context. So if the book was about elephants, then you'd say, it's a baby elephant with a parent. I remember when doing this training a lot, everyone would assume it was quite maternal, that it was the mother elephant. But I thought, it could be the dad. as well, so you can't tell. And so I think, you know, it depends on the content of the surrounding text as well as for the text, for the image. Where it starts getting quite tricky with alternative text is for graphical kind of information. So what I've got down here is a chart, and so I've got we've got different types of information here, and I guess me speaking to it will actually probably give you an example of how I would tackle this as an alternative text. So I wouldn't say, okay, there's a vertical line with numbers on it, a horizontal line with rabbit, dog, cat, goldfish, hamster, then there's a red rectangle that sort of goes up to 4, and that's the one that's rabbit. You don't really need all of that information to come across in the audio description. The important is the data that it's trying to get across. So this could quite easily be rabbit 4, dog 8, cat 11, goldfish 6, and hamster 5. That's all the adaptive, all the alternative text needs to be, the data. And so sometimes what I've done with people that have created, you know, if there's a chart in the document, is that there might be I might put a table at the bottom of the document as an appendix, and so that it can be referred to that way. Or sometimes even the table underneath it is really helpful. And I'm finding actually a lot of, and this is a very strong theme you find with accessible content, is that a lot of sighted people will appreciate having the data straight underneath the graph too, because some people get increasingly skeptical about graphs and data, you know, data represented in different ways, and want to see a little bit of the raw data in there. So accessibility is just another reason to sort of, for, you know, being more transparent with that data. Okay, so charts I find a little straightforward. The tricky one is flow diagrams, and flow diagrams and things like flow diagrams get quite tricky in terms of how you describe them. But again, if we sort of step back into what I was saying, so this flow diagram is about checking if a lamp works or doesn't work. And so you could tackle this by kind of saying that, okay, there's a page of different shapes. Starting at the top, there is a pink rectangle, and the rectangles have radius corners, and within that box, it has the text lamp doesn't work. There's an arrow pointing down to it, to a diamond that's yellow. And I could keep on going like that. How I tackle this is actually to sort of think of it in terms of something that's more conversational. The way I kind of picture it in my head is that you, and this is sort of my general advice, and again, it's a little bit of an oversimplification, but can be really tricky and can be helpful, is to think how you would deal with this if you were telling someone over the phone. Because I think that can be a bit more relatable for a lot of people. And so how you could do this is very much in the narrative sort of format. You can say, okay, first thing you do is, you know, so your lamp doesn't work. Okay, have you tried plugging it in? Okay, if that doesn't work, has the bulb burned out? Try replacing the bulb. Okay, if that doesn't work, then go and buy a new lamp. You could actually just write that in a couple of sentences or a few bullet points. So you don't have to you have to sort of think of the information that it's trying to get across, not necessarily the exact detail of what the format actually is. Okay, so that was images. We've got layout as well. So layout had its own acronym. It could have been worse, but we went with CARP, which is contrast, alignment, repetition, and proximity. And so for the first one, we've got contrast. And contrast is probably the biggest one of all of these that I think has the most sort of influence. So So I think with contrast, the statement that I really liked about with contrast, and I just got a few statements that sort of to talk about this, is if elements are not the same, make them very different. So what again, it's not something that we see very often with print documents or anything, but definitely online. I've definitely seen sort of some areas, and councils can be sort of quite sort of guilty of this. They're sort of color theming different areas and different departments without any consideration of the accessibility of them. And I've actually seen voting papers that were yellow writing on white text, which kind of surprised me a little bit. So I get it in terms of that they were trying to color code it. That was their theme, their brand, yellow. And you can get very sort of blinkered into thinking that that's what you need to do, and readability is kind of like not even thought of. And as soon as you sort of point it out, they go, "Oh gosh, yes, you're right," and then it needs to be kind of figured out. And so I think that's what I find is the most common trap in terms of when you see poor contrast, is because of a kind of a color coding or a branding, color combination that's sort of being sort of required to use. Alignment. Again, alignment's really helpful for keeping everything together. When you have things sort of closer together, people naturally think that those two things are actually connected. I think sort of bullet points are probably a good way of describing these, because when things have the same kind of bullet point, you know that they're all connected. So a lot of these things that you do within this layout things, you do automatically because the tools like creating bullets or a numbered list automatically do them for you. Alignment's quite important because when a lot of people, if they're using magnification, it gives them like an anchoring point to know where to go to when it's being magnified. Otherwise, it can go kind of all over the place, and you can actually miss entire content as well if it's not aligned. Some people will kind of say that it has to be all left aligned, but sort of my experience through people using it is that as if it's all lined the same, then when you've started, you know where to sort of to go around to be able to move. Repetition is another one, is keeping the same look and feel without the document. Again, this is another one which I think a lot of people do instinctively. But if you're using bullets, using the same kind of bullets through the thing, and again, this is usually done for you because of if you're using any branding that's gone through, you'll be using the same sort of visual elements. There's also proximity, and this sort of like ties in with alignment as well. That items relating to each other should be grouped closer together as well. And so that's sort of like a good example of that is having a bulleted list and sort of like a numbered list so that everyone sort of like will naturally group them together, and that helps create those things. So a lot of the things you do naturally within like a Word document not only help visually for sighted people that use it, but it also helps out with the accessibility of it. So you're actually if you actually even just using the bulleting functions of like Word or Google Docs, you're actually helping out with accessibility. Okay, so the next one we're talking about was layouts is tables. Tables is interesting. I actually had a little exercise. It'll be interesting to try this via Zoom. Now, tables can be really tricky in terms of being able to read out if you're using a screen reader like we've used in the past, or we talked about in the last workshop. And what I've got on the next slide is what a screen reader would say. And so my little challenge to you is that while I read it out, see if you can draw or picture in your head what that table looks like. So I'll read this out. And this is technically an accessible table. So this table is actually, the screen reader reads out everything accurately, but this is what you get, a little sample of what it actually is read. So I'll read it out. So Okay, so we've got, it's a non-uniform table. Title, row 1 of 3, column 1 of 2 is date, column 2 of 2 is name, row 2 of 3, number of columns is changed from 2 to 3, code, column 2 of 3, currency, column 3, address, row 3 of 3, column 1 of 3, country, column 2 of 3, reference, column 3 of 3. I hope, fingers crossed, you're all a bit confused. You should be. The only people that I've known actually understand this are actual screen reader users when I've read this out. And they go like, oh, yeah, and they understand it straight away. Well, it's still a bit tricky. So I'll take a little sneak peek now at what that table actually looks like. That's what the table actually looks like. Not an overly complex table. Probably the two things we say to try and avoid when using table data or table information from accessibility is having merged cells. And that's when it starts getting sort of confusing, as you're saying with the, so if we go back to the text version, you'll say that it says, number of columns changed from 2 to 3. So from an accessibility point of view, it was very accurate. It said, so there was title and date at the top, and then after it read out the date in the table, it quite rightfully said that there were 2 columns and now there are 3 columns. But it's very hard to kind of picture all this information actually in your head. So my advice came to, again, try to create something nice and easy to use was for using tables, was keep everything small, simple, and symmetrical, was the advice. And probably one piece of information per cell within a table. I probably forgot to mention, I've also got a handout that that I'll email out as well, and that can be shared out, that has all the written up all this information too. Okay, the last one. Notice I'm racing through things. I've got a little demonstration I can do later on, that talks about these sort of headings. The last one is dealing with headings in a document, and I find it's kind of nice that headings is last, because it's probably the most important one also within books, and it's really I say it's called headings, but it's really adding a semantic structure into your resources and into books as well. So within like ePUB and PDF, they're really the same as in terms of being able to add something to the text so that it's calling that text out to say, hey, this is the heading, and it's sort of at a higher level than the rest of the text. And the reason why this becomes really important is this information is used by the screen readers to kind of skip into sort of like different headings through the document. And that's why I kind of said that the heading structure is probably the most important accessibility consideration in a Word document. Like if you just use headings, it's probably the biggest thing that you can do for like accessibility. So I realized I've gone through things really quickly, and so what I've got now is I can go into Word now and just give you a little bit of a demonstration of of how these actually work. And then once I know that demonstration, we'll have some time for questions. Right. Hang on. Okay. So what I've got here, I remember I did this training once and I handed this out and someone actually made the lemon cake once. And my apologies, because the other thing that people always say is like, oh, Tom, why do you use recipes? Because it always makes me hungry. A, I like to cook, and so recipes are good for me. But B, from an accessibility training point of view, I like it because it's got an image, it's got a bulleted list and a numbered list and some different sort of types of headings. So I'm just in Word. And so one of the things that sort of we're talking about here is that some of you, I'm not sure, might be a stranger to this bar up here where it has all this heading 1, heading 2 kind of stuff, hoping that you're not, especially sort of from the library point of view. But one of the other great things is that not only is this an accessibility tool, it is how you're supposed to format Word documents. And this sort of links back to what I was saying at the very beginning about how important it is to use, if you use the accessibility tools or think from an accessible point of view, you can actually make your workflow and your work a lot more efficient rather than actually taking more work. It can actually take less work. So one example is that because I've used like these heading levels within a Word document.
Sorry, Tom.
Yeah.
We're still seeing your PowerPoint presentation,
right.
not the Word one. Thank you.
No, thank you. How's that?
Much better, thank you.
Right, sorry, thank you. Okay, thank you for that. Okay, so right, so sorry, here's the cake that I was saying. It looks nice, and I was saying my apologies for making anybody hungry. But so what you simply do here is that you, when you're in the paragraph of a heading, which is the sour cream lemon cake, you simply select heading 1, and then sort of in this case I've got ingredients, and then I'll do heading 2, and then in method I've got heading 2 as well. And one of the benefits of being able to do this is you see you have a navigation pane. And this is one of the things when I receive a Word document and someone wants to check it for accessibility, I'll check the navigation to see if it's got a heading structure in it. If I take this now and then save it as a PDF or save it as an ePUB like I take it before, these headings will make the PDF and the ePUB accessible as well. So people will be able to use the screen reader to be able to navigate the headings within the PDF and the ePUB if it was created in here. But one of the really great things about is that because I've created this structure, I can then actually just completely change the look and feel of the document because it's applying this formatting to the heading levels within that document. Also, if you add a table of contents, it will also be automatically generated from the heading information that you've got. And what's great is that if you, again, if you're using all the heading structures, it knows where those heading values are on the pages, and so you can just update the table of contents without having to rewrite your whole your table of contents over again. So when you, so I'm just sort of the part I'm banging on here is that being accessible also means that you become a better Word user at the same time. So one of the things I just wanted to talk about is the accessibility checker. Is built in. So the built-in accessibility checker in Word, I feel, is really good. I had a real nice opportunity. The head of accessibility from Microsoft came to New Zealand quite a while ago, and the poor guy was getting beaten up by a lot of people because there were a lot of things that he needed to hear. But it was nice to be able to say, hey, the accessibility checker in Word, I think is really good. And he said, thank you. He said it's something that they were the most proud of. So that was quite nice. Still, you know, has some issues. It doesn't pick out color contrast issues, but it does pick out what I refer to as like accessibility roadblocks. And how you do that is you go File and straight into File Info, there's check for issues. And then one of your options there is check accessibility. And one of the great things about this accessibility checker is that it picks up all the things. So you don't need to remember a lot of all the tools that, all the things that it goes through, because it'll go through. And not only will it tell you, so it's kind of picked out that this image doesn't have any alt text, which I talked about before. It will actually tell you why you should fix it. And then it tells you actually how to fix it as well. And that's one of the reasons why I kind of, I really like it, is because it's almost like a spell check for accessibility that you've got built into Word. And so how I can actually add it, so it says here, select and fix the how to fix. So it says right click on the object, click format picture, and then click the size and properties, and then we'll see we've got alt text here. This is where it does get a little bit confusing within Word, because there's two areas. If you're ever unsure, you fill in both, but it's actually the description that screen readers actually use. So I can simply type in here slice of lemon cake. And you can see that it's live, and as I've written that slice of lemon cake in there, it's then sort of taken that error straight away out of the accessibility checker that's there on the right hand panel. So in summary, that's kind of like what I was wanting to just sort of to really get across. Is probably the number one thing to take away was having the accessibility checker that's built into Word. There's accessibility checkers for all sorts of different sort of types of software as well. But there's sort of two takeaways that I wanted to be able to do from this session. One was that the content that you have in the library, like ePUBs and stuff, can be really accessible. The content has been, but that obviously relies on the publisher applying these principles to their documents before their material before it's actually sent out. Probably the big one is things like having the heading structure and having the alternate text within images, so that when you're reading a book through like Libby or BorrowBox, that content is accessible as well. And then the second sort of takeaway of this is that any content that you create as well can be very easily accessible as well. It doesn't have to be a lot of work, and actually in a lot of cases it can actually make things a lot easier. So I have a bit of some time for questions. Right. Yes, right, feeling hungry.
So if anybody's got any questions, do you just want to unmute yourself and ask away, or if you prefer, pop them in the chat and we can check them?
Yeah, are you happy to chat or both? I know someone's asked about font size. Font size, generally when we do large print, we go 18 point. And then PowerPoint, I think we went 32. I remember some great advice for PowerPoint slides was no more than 7 words a slide. If you can do that, you're doing really well. So your font size is a good one. And I think the font size actually brings up an interesting topic for me, in terms of one of the things that makes things quite accessible is the reader being able to choose what they want. So for a good example is that there's a dyslexic font, and I have read some people say that it is life-changing, that having the dyslexic font means now that the whole world of books is now open to them, and before they just found it too difficult to read. And yet at the same time, I've seen some dyslexic readers that said they hate it and they want to burn it with fire, it's horrible, and they don't like it. And the thing is that I think they're both right. And I think that it's being able to have the choice is what makes sort of content more accessible. And when it comes to font size, it's being able to make the text larger for what you require from that point of view. Because I've had people tell me they receive a book in they take a A4 page and then they just blow it up to A3 and hope that works. And then with some eye conditions that can actually make things worse, because it's not bigger, doesn't always make things better. So font size, for me, I mean, like the easy short answer is we normally go 12, the standard, so that if people are magnifying it, they can use it to magnify it. We use when we're creating large print text or large print materials in-house here at Blind Low Vision NZ, it's usually 18 point. But my overall philosophy is to give choice to the reader and being able to make it bigger or smaller, which gets conflicting with a lot of with books. If you know, especially with a print book and it's art, and I get that as well, that you want your book to look as pretty as possible, and the thought that somebody could take your book and put it purple and green with Comic Sans, you know, could be horrifying. So I can see that there's those challenges to it. Hang on, see if there's any other. Right, we fixed the. Sorry about the hungry thing. Yeah.
I'd be interested to know if anybody out there is actually doing some of this work, you know, and what your experience has been.
Yeah. And any advice for graphic design, example posters? Yeah, a lot of the things that we talked about doing design for posters, probably the thing that's unique for posters, I would say, is lighting, ensuring that you put them in a place that, you know, that they can be seen. Another area for light is doing with glare as well. So if it's quite a glossy paper, and this feedback's really based on feedback I've had from people that have had difficulty reading it, and glare is quite a common one for sort of people using quite glossy paper, especially for posters. And then if there's a light shining off it or reflecting off it, then it gets quite tricky. So the two get to it, go hand in hand, because obviously if you've got a poster, you want it well lit. If the material is glossy, then you've got the light sort of bouncing off it, and so glare can sometimes be a little bit of an issue as well. Here internally, sometimes we have Braille embossed over the top of posters, but in saying that, what gets tricky about that is that people need to know how do they know that Braille is there, is how do they know that Braille is actually there to be able to access it in the first place. Hang on. Anyway, so thanks, Tom. The Australian Philadelphia presentation team, but have read that it's important for some people to have a warning that something is going to open up in a new window rather than opening in a new window. Are you able to tell me more about that? A little bit from my web accessibility days. I do know that you know, warning that some content is actually coming up in a new window, I think is within the web standards, and that's where I would actually look to for guidance on the best practice for being able to do that. I can't think of it off the top of my mind, but I do know that, yeah, that you're definitely right, that it's obviously quite disorientating if you're in one window and then a pop-up suddenly comes up. I do know that a lot of screen readers, they do actually read out. I mean, if you've coded them the right way, that that would automatically pop up to say, oh, a pop-up's come out to say, you know, are you okay? I mean, I guess the big example is for cookies on a web page, that it goes through on that. So to go back to your question, I think it's the web accessibility standards do have guidelines around about any warnings that are required for new windows. Oh, linked content. Yes, okay. Right, yes, linked content is a good one, because one way people navigate around, I said, was like headings, and how actually a screen reader works to display. If you look at visually, it displays a list of all the headings. So within my sour cream lemon cake example, if I was using a screen reader, I could just hit H, and it would go sour cream lemon cake, and then hit H again, and then it would say ingredients, and then I'd hit H again, and then I could go to method. Now you can do the same thing with links within a web page, or if you've got hyperlinks within a document. And so, and I know people actually do use this, you know, and sort of like in the wild, as we sort of like say, that people will go from link to link. And then what becomes quite problematic is that people will use click here. And so what happens is that if someone's trying to navigate this way, they get a whole list of things that just say click here, click here, click here, click here, over and over again. So you're right. The idea is that if you're using links or typing in a URL, is to try and make them as sort of as clear as possible. And the example I always used to give was the Human Rights Commission. So you wouldn't write to access the Human Rights Commission, click here, and then make the click here, you know, a link. so the idea is just to try and take the text of Human Rights Commission and then make that the hyperlink so that you could actually link it through that way. And so making the text sort of like read out. So to make a long story short, you want to try to make the text that's visibly the selectable text that you've got, or the clickable text that you've got on there, as understandable in isolation, so that you can actually, understand where you're actually going to. And that also becomes a bit of a problem when you have the full URL address of something, when it becomes sort of, https:/... things. And that's not so bad, but it's just, as you can imagine, when it's read out to you, it's quite sort of, a lot of information to take in. So shortening it down and making it concise, but it's avoiding the big one we used to see all the time, and I still see it, is the click here, read more links, and the advice was always just to avoid using those. I hope that helps. Oh, great. And as I was saying, I've got a handout that I'll send out so that it can be sort of passed to you. It has all the information. It actually has things in a little bit more detail that we've gone through here. So we've done sort of like a for exemplars in terms of web or documents or web. A good resource. I mean, obviously there's the Web Consortium, the Web Content. Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, but I find a great resource is called WebAIM, which is WEBAIM. I think it's the University of Utah, I'm going to say. And they're a great resource because what I like about them is, from a web accessibility point of view, they really portray information quite well in a very easy to understand kind of way. Because I think if you go straight into the web accessibility guidelines, they're quite intimidating. But if you go straight to WebAIM, they're really helpful. And I find, and they've kind of condensed it down into sort of like a few pages, so you can, and then if you get interested, you can get into sort of like a little bit more detail. But they have really good resources there, and they even have something that's called the Wave tool. Which where you can plug in your website, and it's a free tool, and it will give you a kind of an accessibility check. And I kind of like a lot of web accessibility and these word accessibility tools are kind of like what I call like a warrant of fitness. Like you take your car in to get a warrant. It doesn't mean you got a great car. It means you just passed the warrant. Accessibility and usability mesh together. So just because your website's accessible, it still might mean someone might have to press the tab key 72, and that's why I put in that table example, is that table that I read out was accessible, but it's not it's not necessarily sort of like very friendly. So yeah, so I mean, just passing the standards doesn't always mean that you've got a great document or great sort of like website. So we're just coming into the last couple of minutes. Thanks for all the questions, people. That's really great seeing it on the chat, and it's really helpful. It's really cool to see it from my point of view.
Cool. So unless anybody's going to pop something in now, yeah, it's always nice to know there's people out there listening.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, thanks so much, everybody, for attending, and hope you can come along. Tom's doing 2 more workshops, one on the 7th of July, which is going to be on accessibility features for Libby and Press Reader. And I have to say, I've been putting off getting glasses because I read on Libby and I can just make the font bigger, saving me some money at the moment. And then the last one's on August the 4th, which is about making accessible copies and introducing you to the LIANZA's produced some guidelines on Marrakesh as well. Oh, yeah. So that would be really helpful too. So thanks so much, everyone, yeah, and thanks so much, Tom. And I'll just quickly close with a karakia, and then you can go off and get on with your days. Thank you. Unahia, unahia, unahia ki te uru tapanui, kia wātea, kia mama, te nāko, te tidana, te wairoa, i te ara takatā. Koia rā I rongo, whakairia aki ki runga, kia tina, hui e, tai ki e. Thanks so much, everyone, and thanks, Tom. It was really interesting, and I might have to go and make sour cream lemon cake now. So I hope the recipe comes on the on the handouts, and we'll certainly send those out to everyone.
Yeah, I'll send both out. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay. All right. See you next time, everyone.